Let's bring in now former CIA Director Jim Woolsey and counterterrorism expert David Gartenstein-Ross. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. You just heard Clarissa Ward saying, we believe this looks like the trappings of an ISIS attack. Director Woolsey, does that make sense to you?
Yes, definitely. The Kurdish attacks from the separatists and PKK generally focus on military and on instruments of government. They're not trying to destroy Turkish society. They want to carve off part of it for a Kurdish state. Whereas ISIS attacks are horrific, and they are oriented it's very clearly, usually, toward spreading horror and terror and impacting as many civilians as possible, and in places where civilians gather together. Everybody is saying that this looks like ISIS, and it definitely does. It's kind of an interesting, well, more than kind of, it's a very interesting shift in ISIS's overall approach. If this is an ISIS attack in Turkey, they may have bitten off more than they can chew.
Let's talk about why. David, why does ISIS usually avoid these types of attacks in Turkey? Do you believe that this is a reflection of them losing the war on the ground in and around that region?
Well, I wouldn't agree that they actually avoid these kind of attacks in Turkey. They've carried out some spectacular attacks before. Go back to October when you had an ISIS attack at a peace rally that killed over 100 people. What they haven't been able to do is carry out a major attack against something like the Istanbul airport, but given other airport attacks and other major attacks that they've carried out against similar soft targets and mosques throughout the region and also in Europe, it's not out of step with what they've been doing. Now, I do think ISIS is desperate, but I wouldn't link that to this specific attack because it's in line with what they were doing even when they were strong. I think they're desperate because they're losing, and that's very clear. You can see that on the battlefield in Iraq and Syria. They've lost Fallujah. They've had a steady stream of losses over the course of the past 6 months where their caliphate is under extreme pressure, and they're about to lose their African capital as well, that being the city of Sirte, Libya. So let's recognize their weakness. Let's recognize the fact that they're experiencing battlefield losses, but that isn't necessarily why they're carrying out terrorist attacks abroad, because that's been a constant for them.
Director Woolsey, there's a lot of talk about ISIS, specifically in the state of play of the election. Donald Trump just came out with a statement about this attack, saying we need to think about waterboarding and matching tactics with ISIS. Hillary Clinton said we need to think about how to deepen our alliances. Of those two statements, which one do you think makes more sense in terms of how to continue progress against ISIS?
Well, taking the gloves off and deepening alliances, both are reasonable things to do. One wants, I think, to realize that this is going to take an understanding that we have not vanquished the hardest part of ISIS by proceeding effectively in Syria and Iraq. We have got to essentially root them out here at home and in Europe and elsewhere in the world, and that is going to take a long time and be very difficult. We've got to utilize publicly available data from things like Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of that in order to try to keep track of where some of these people are and what they may be planning and doing and who they're associating with. That entails steps that people sometimes don't want the U.S. federal government to take. On the other hand, Amazon knows a lot more about your purchasing habits than the United States government today. If the information is out there and available publicly and it can help follow and track down terrorists, we probably should do our best to use it.
Is that what you mean by taking the gloves off, or are you saying that you support the notion that Donald Trump has of going back to waterboarding and having more harsh tactics to be like the way ISIS fights?
Well, 3 people were waterboarded, 2 of them, I think, once each. The vast majority of waterboarding was with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was bin Laden's chief of staff and had a great deal of information about future operations. I think waterboarding is a tough tactic. On the other hand, it's one that is utilized in the training of our special forces, like Navy SEALs. I knew several journalists who went out and were waterboarded when this first came up because they wanted to see what it was like so they could write articles about it. We don't have people, people don't tear out their fingernails, a torture method, in order to be able to write an article about fingernails being torn out. So I think waterboarding is complicated, but it's not the main point. The main point is all this data is out there in public and available and used for marketing and so forth by a business. We need to have a public-private partnership in which the government and the companies that work in these areas can work together for essentially the needs of the country as a whole. We need to get into the mentality we were in shortly after December 7th of 1941.
Understood.
We need to pull all together.
That's an ongoing political discussion that we've been having in this country. Each event resets that debate. We'll see where it goes from here. David Gartenstein Ross, former Director Woolsey, thank you very much for your perspective.
Thank
Allison.
you.